There's a lot to say. I was born in a small, mid-sized town in Poland named Grodno. It's very interesting town. I thought always was a beautiful, and we lived on a street that led from the central square, the Batory Square in Grodno, that led to the castle. The castle in Polish is Zamek, and the street was named Zamkowa, the castle street, sort of. And it was very nice. I enjoyed it very much, except for one thing, because it was so close to the castle, and there were many senior officers of the Polish army in the castle. It seemed to me like every week or 2 weeks one of them died, and then there would be a funeral procession along the street. Now, I should be happy with all the music and everything, but I used to stand by the window and cry, and I didn't know I was crying because I didn't know it was a funeral procession. No, but what can I tell you? My parents both worked. Grandma, my grandma, my mother's mother, didn't live with us, but she spent a great deal of time with us. She couldn't really take care of me except in the house, and she was good at making food. I thought she was a marvelous cook. Only much later I found out that she was a terrible cook, but I didn't know it because I loved her so much. And because she lived with us, and I have to apologize in advance. I'm just going with a story, not with a horror story necessarily, but about my life at that age. And because she had the difficulty getting out of the house, she was quite heavy. I didn't get out of the house very much either, because I was at that time 3-4 years old, and I couldn't go along by myself in the street. And it was a bit more than a bit of a problem for me, because it was boring staying in the house, even though we had a radio, and when my father bought a radio, brought 3 radios. They weren't made so well in those days, so you had to compare them, and all that. But to the rescue came a cousin. Her name, Leah Stein. And a marvelous thing happened. As I said, I was 3.5-4 years old. She used to come, at least when she wasn't in school, on the summer vacation, she used to come almost every day. But certainly, always she came 2 or 3 times a week. And she would take me for a walk through the city. That's very nice, we go for a walk. But I was a very curious little fellow, and I used to ask her, what's this store? What does this say? And what does this say? What is this? And suddenly, at the age of 3.5, I started to read. Just because she showed me the street signs. And from then on, of course, reading became my big passion, and to this very day. So it was a wonderful thing with her. It helped me a lot. But we eventually moved from there to a bigger apartment on the other side of the main square in town. It's Plac Batorego in Polish, Batory Square. And we moved to a larger apartment, and then the Russians invaded. It happens all the time. You live in countries like that, the Russians. We had no problems with the Russians. We were of the proletariat, we didn't own any big properties of that, so we were okay with the communists. But my father was walking one day in the Batory Square, and he saw a friend of his speaking to a Russian officer. And this friend calls him. My father's name was Grigory, the full name was Grisha, abbreviated, and his friend calls to him and says, Grisha, come, I want you to meet this officer. Okay, his friend calls him to meet this Russian officer. Come. He says, this is the Russian officer. His name is Nikolai Ivanovich Tumanov. That's quite a mouthful, you appreciate. He says, he's looking for a room to rent. And I know you have a big apartment. Maybe you'd rent him a room. And father, for some reason, immediately said yes. He didn't discuss it with my mother or with anybody. He said, yes, I'll rent him a room. The fact is, that was what saved our lives. The very fact that we rented him a room. He was a wonderful person. When the Russian tanks first moved in on our street where we lived, that same apartment, I didn't know what the terrible noise was outside, the terrible noise of the tanks. And immediately I asked, what are these big monster vehicles? And he said, these are Russian tanks. So, as I told you, I was already reading. So I said, Russian is, I said, that's a different language, not like Polish. He says, yeah, it's a different language. He says, but I want to learn to read Russian. That's the first thing I said to him. That was important to me. The Russians invaded us, and to me it was important that I should be able to read Russian. So he moved in with us, and he was a wonderful man. He was a senior officer in quite a secret department of the Russian army. But he, every day, used to come in the evening home and sit with me for an hour or 2 hours and help me read Russian. And that was one thing. In the end, he was actually instrumental in saving our lives altogether. But that was the first thing. I'll skip around a little bit, and what happened was, again, he was transferred. The Russians invaded Lithuania. They kept on invading all the time. And he was transferred, and it was transferred to Kaunas, which is the second largest city of Lithuania. And he says to my parents, what do you say you come with me to Kaunas? Now, we had a big family in Grodno. We had grandparents and aunts and uncles and sisters, and it was wonderful. I mean, I remember going on every Shabbat, going for dinner to my grandmother. We used to walk there, and we used to sit and have dinner. And my grandmother, for some reason, I didn't understand it first, we used to always get angry at me. And I couldn't understand why she got angry at me. It turned out that she used to make gefilte fish, and like people used to do in Poland, on each slice of fish she put a little carrot. And I immediately removed all the carrots because I like the carrots. We got it straightened out. Anyway, my grandfather was also a very interesting person. They had a grocery store, but he didn't work in a grocery store. He did all sorts of things. But before the war, before the First World War, he had an arrangement with the Russian army, the Russians that were also then. And he had a very, very lucrative business with the Russian army. I know some of you may know that historically the Russian artillery was known throughout the world as the best artillery in the world. So he used to go on the maneuvers of the Russian artillery near Grodno, near our town, take a bunch of workers with them, and they would start firing. And the moment they stopped firing, he'd get all these workers out there to pick up all the metal. And this is what he used to sell back to the Russians. It was very, very clever. So it was very nice source of income. Anyway, we had a big family in Grodno. We left them all. We went to Kaunas. Kaunas wasn't that far. It was about a 3-hour trip by car in Lithuania.